Hello and welcome to our Bible study as we continue to track through the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. I'm, of course, your host, Pastor Edwin Weber, coming to you from Spokane, Washington, provided by the ministry of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. Welcome. Last time, we ended with uncertainty. Uncertainty about who would reign in David's stead after his death. David is on his deathbed when he hears that one of his sons, Adonijah, was actually throwing a celebratory feast in anticipation of his father's death and him becoming king. And of course, this is a major insult. Who does this? Who throws a feast of celebration when their father is dying? But it's also in contradiction to David's own wishes. David wanted to make Solomon king. In fact, it was Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, who, upon hearing news of Adonijah's feast, it was she who comes to David and who tells him about what is going on. You see, David had made a promise to her that it would be her son, Solomon, who would sit on the throne after him. And what I love about Bathsheba in the story is that she holds David to that promise. So Solomon is made king, as it has been before. This is through an anointing. Solomon is anointed by the high priest, who is Zadok at this point, and by Nathan the prophet. You may remember that Nathan is the one who has filled Samuel's shoes. He's now the principal prophet of Israel. And then after Solomon is anointed king, Adonijah, he comes in peace to ask for forgiveness for his rebellion. But interestingly enough, Adonijah does not ask for forgiveness from Solomon. He does not ask it from David. Adonijah goes to Bathsheba. And I love in this story how her role, it's just totally changed. Last week, she was such a passive character. It was more like a pawn in a game that other people have used. This week she speaks with her own voice. She holds men accountable. She is a kingmaker, literally, and secures her son's reign. And of course, her son's reign would turn out to be among the most splendid of any of the biblical kings. So Solomon is a young man. He's newly king after David's death. He is sort of settling into his reign. He's a young man, but he seems to be doing pretty well. He fills the role of spiritual leader for God's people, for this nation. And he does this through, doing the right things you're supposed to do, praising God through offerings and sacrifices. And so, one night, God comes to Solomon in a dream. And God says that whatever Solomon asks, God will grant it. To put Solomon on a bit of a point, don't you think? What would you do if God asked that of you? What would you ask for? Now, Solomon responds by saying this to God. Now, my Lord God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child, and I do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? So in the end, Solomon asks for wisdom, not for riches or for a long life. Maybe some of those things are things we would ask for. But Solomon asked to be a wise and discerning ruler. In doing this, he demonstrates that he already has a bit of wisdom, right, in requesting this. And he also demonstrates his humility, which is really important. And both of these things, his humility, his wisdom, it pleases God. And God says that because of this, God will grant him wisdom and a lot more. Wisdom and riches and honor. And as we will see, God does indeed grant these things to Solomon. And in fact, in the very next section, we already see the way in which Solomon's wisdom plays out with the story of the baby in Solomon's court. You might know this story. It's pretty famous. The story goes something like this. Two women, two prostitutes, were brought before Solomon. Sorry about that. This is the right image. Two women were brought before Solomon along with a young child. And both of these women, they claimed that the child is their own. It would seem that one of these women, her child died, tragically died while sleeping last night. And now one of them is claiming that the living infant is her own. And, this is an incredibly tense situation. But the challenge for Solomon here, of course, is the question, who is telling the truth? It's a she said situation, and everybody's looking to Solomon. Solomon, their king, Solomon, their judge, to discern who is telling the truth and to enact justice in the midst of the people. So what does Solomon do? He orders the guards to take the child and to kill it. Take the sword and divide her into two. And, that way that's fair, right? Each woman can get half. That seems fair. Of course, we know what Solomon is actually doing. And as it turns out, it actually worked. The child's true mother wails while the impostor is indifferent. And it's, of course, because her child is already dead. And in this way, Solomon learns the truth. He restores the child to her rightful mother. And this story, it really reveals to us, the wisdom that God has granted this young king. And through it, by it, God shows God's favor. Now, I mentioned earlier, that wisdom is only the start of what God is going to be giving Solomon. But it is through wisdom that those other things come to him. Solomon gains wealth and honor through the right and just administration of his kingdom. And in fact, Kings and Chronicles, they both go into a lot of detail about the wealth and splendor of Solomon. And the vision we kind of get is a king who understood and properly administrated his kingdom. Solomon understands commerce, taxation, labor, the machines of war. All of these things are places where the Bible tells us that Solomon excelled and gained favor in this way. And in particular, the wealth of Solomon goes into an enormous amount of public building projects. And in particular, that is the temple in Jerusalem and Solomon's palace, also in Jerusalem. Both Kings and Chronicles, they go into incredible detail about the construction of the temple. Two whole chapters in both books that are dedicated to things like the dimensions of the temple and the craftsmanship that went into its construction. Many of the vessels and appointments in the temple, they were made of gold or bronze or other valuable material. One of those materials is, of course, cedar. Cedars from Lebanon, which were highly prized in those days as a fine building material. And just in general, the incredible amount of artistry and craftsmanship that goes into the temple complex is highly emphasized, including the musicians and the priests, the worship leaders, all of that in incredible detail in both Kings and Chronicles. And you need not read all four of these chapters, but I just wanted to give them to you as an opportunity if you want to glance at them and take a look, see the kinds of things that go into it. So Solomon plans the temple. He uses his wisdom and his wealth to make this all happen. And finally, the temple is completed. The Ark of God is brought into the Holy of Holies, and the temple is consecrated. Solomon is there at the dedication. He has a long prayer that he says at the dedication of the temple. It's a very interesting prayer, but it's a bit long. I put the verses here. I suggest you read it, but you can also just sort of peruse it because it is long. But there's some really interesting things that go on there. Solomon's humility is again emphasized. Solomon's emphasis on praising God is really very clearly there. But there's also another interesting part. Because Solomon's prayer is an incredible little bit of foreshadowing. Because he brings up these odd hypotheticals in his prayer. Odd in the sense that they would have been odd in Solomon's day, but perhaps not so odd in the wider context of what we know will be happening in the story of Kings and Chronicles. For example, Solomon preemptively begs God's forgiveness and mercy, just in case if sometime in the future God's people go astray and worship other gods. And of course, we know that worshiping other gods is going to be a significant legacy of most of the kings of both Israel and Judah. Solomon even goes on to entreat God, saying that when the people have turned away from God and worshiping other gods, and when God hands the people over to foreign invaders who remove the people from the land, Solomon asks for forgiveness from God and that God relents and restores. Considering that the end of this story is exile, where foreign invaders do conquer and deport the Jewish people, this is some significant foreshadowing here. The temple is dedicated in this story, but even here, the seeds of its destructions are alluded to in this prayer. But so too is its restoration. Now, the construction of the temple certainly is framed in Kings as Chronicles. It's really the zenith of Solomon's reign. And it's been a spiritual destination that God's people have been on for a long time. Ever since God gave the law to Moses, these people have been looking for this place, this one place that God will show them, where they will worship God. And now it has finally been fulfilled. And so the Bible does go into a lot of detail about the building of the temple. And then it kind of glosses over the rest of Solomon's building works. But it's important that we not forget that Solomon also did these things. After the temple, the next biggest thing that Solomon made, well, I should say biggest, as you will see, the biggest thing that's emphasized is Solomon's palace. And I say not the biggest because Solomon's palace, by the measurements in the actual Bible, is actually larger than the temple. And I kind of get a kick out of that because it's 4 chapters about the temple and then just like a little bit about the palace. But by the measurements, Solomon actually built a bigger palace for himself than the temple. Um, and this is also after David. David built his own palace in Jerusalem. There's already a palace there. Did Solomon really need a second bigger palace than what was already there? Did Solomon really need a palace that was bigger than God's house, a place of public worship? Just some interesting questions as we look at the latter reign of King Solomon. Now, one of the most celebrated stories of Solomon is one that's about the Queen of Sheba. And I bet you've heard of her, even if maybe you don't know all the details of this story. You may not have even heard of Sheba as a country, as a land outside of the context of the story. And the truth is, we don't know exactly where Sheba was. It could be in modern day Ethiopia or modern day Somalia, maybe even modern day Yemen. We just don't know. But the story it's significant. It's interesting, I should say. The Queen of Sheba, in this story, she learns in her far off land of the wisdom of Solomon, and she decides to go to him to see what she could learn. And again, thinking about how far, again, we don't know exactly where she was coming from, but regardless, it was a long journey, a dangerous journey through the desert, So she comes to Jerusalem, she comes before Solomon to learn from him. We're told that she brings with her the wealth of her country. She brings with her spices and gold, incense and jewels. And you kind of get the sense that this was a trade mission. And considering how much of Kings and Chronicles talks about the wealth and prosperity of the kingdom under Solomon, you can kind of understand why she may have come as a trade mission. Now, in the end, the Queen of Sheba, she is impressed by Solomon. She's impressed by his vast wealth, by the immensity of his kingdom, and by his wisdom. And they sort of exchange gifts, and she goes home. Part of what's interesting about this story is how it's easy to miss this. But the Queen of Sheba is, of course, she is a woman. She is a Gentile. And even she is drawn to the wisdom which flows from God as expressed in the person of King Solomon. Isaiah, the author of Isaiah 60, would actually play around with this notion several generations later when he envisions that the enlightenment brought by the Lord's anointed would draw all people to God. Isaiah writes, "And all from Sheba will come, bearing gold and incense and proclaiming the praise of the Lord." And we can go one step further because you might know this, that Matthew, the gospel writer, draws on this passage from Isaiah 60, and writes a story about 3 wise men that come from the east to worship the Christ child, following the brightness of a star. A literal enlightenment that is fulfilled in the babe of Bethlehem, to whom all nations are drawn. And so maybe this Christmas or Epiphany, when you hear that story of the wise men, think to yourself, remember, it all started with the Queen of Sheba. Now, Solomon's reign might have started in a blaze of glory, But much like his father before him, it would seem that aspects of his later reign left things, shall we say, left some things to be desired. Um, Particularly, the Bible tells us that Solomon loved his many wives. And by loved his many wives, I don't mean that he had a lot of love for each and every one of his wives. I mean that he loved having a lot of wives and concubines. I can't remember exactly what the number is, but it's in the hundreds. And many of them, perhaps even most of them, were actually foreign women. And maybe this didn't mean all that much. I mean, we did just talk about the queen of a foreign nation being enlightened by the wisdom of God imparted by Solomon. But foreign wives seems to have brought in foreign gods. And while religious tolerance is a personal value of my own, Solomon seems to take it a step further and actually engages in other god worship. Now, I don't know about you, but growing up, I didn't hear anything about this aspect of Solomon, just about his wisdom and the baby in Solomon's court and all those things. It's something that's actually glossed over a lot. But Kings makes it very clear that Solomon actually erected altars to other gods and worshipped them. Now, we don't have a lot of context for this action, other than it seems to be connected in the author's mind with these foreign gods of Solomon's many wives. And, this kind of ends the note on Solomon with something, it's kind of bitter, it's kind of sad, because it seems that otherwise Solomon had this really amazing reign. But the thing is, as long as we have human beings as kings and queens, and for that matter, presidents and senators and mayors and all kinds of leaders, as long as humans are leaders, humans will always be subject to human weakness. Solomon is no different. No matter how wise or wealthy he was, no matter how much we hold him in regard today. Now, Solomon is accredited with a lot of wisdom literature, a lot like how David is considered to be the author of many of the Psalms. And to be honest with you, we don't have clear historical evidence that supports authorship either way for either David or Solomon. But we do know that the wisdom literature that we have in our Bible, it clearly flows from a tradition in which wisdom is celebrated specifically through the person of King Solomon. Wisdom literature, however, is an entire other Bible study altogether, and perhaps we can tackle some of those books in the near future. But at least until then, thank you for joining me, and peace be with you.